Okay.
It's the host. Yeah, I just said your host.
Okay, good. Working now. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up the last exam and go over this. If there's any questions, please just shout them out. Okay, first question. I'm hoping this was this was free points because this was pretty easy. I think most people got this. So anyway, Emax, Bmax, because this is binding. This is ED50 and this is KD. That should have been pretty easy. Oh, Jesus. Okay, that's just the answer. So the only sneaky thing about this is it says choose all that apply. So there's more than one correct answer here, and they all have to be chosen to get full credit. So partial credit if you missed one. The binding of a ligand to a receptor is due to hydrogen, ionic, and other bonds, changes the conformation of the receptor, and is dependent on both its on rate and its off rate. Okay, so all three of those were right. Formation of the ligand receptor complex is described by K1 times L times R. And again, most of these are pretty easy. I'm hoping, you know, y'all got these right. Y'all. Why am I saying y'all? I'm from Pennsylvania. So full agonist would be this one because it goes all the way up to 100. Which of the following drug actions would result in lowering of cyclic AMP in the cell? So most of these are raising cyclic AMP. Activating GI lowers cyclic GMP. Question 6. In the mechanism that activates the production of IP3, GQ is the G protein activated, and it activates phospholipase C. This then breaks down PIP2 into diacylglycerol and IP3, which binds to the IP3 receptor, releasing calcium from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Which of the following is not a target for PKA? And that is the ryanodine receptor. FKBP 12.6 is a target, and this regulates the ryanodine receptor, so they're related, but this is not directly phosphorylated. The plateau phase of the cardiac action potential between 3 and 4 below is due to, choose all that apply. So you had to put both calcium and potassium because calcium's going in, which is trying to which would make the membrane more positive, but potassium's going out, which makes it more negative. So they kind of cancel each other out to a certain extent, and you get that plateau phase. And we'll talk about that more today, I think. What is Emax? How is it determined? Why may the Emax be different for different ligands? I think this was a pretty easy one, at least I hope it was. Emax is the maximal effect you can get in a tissue. It's determined through a dose response curve. Why can Emax be different? Because you've got different intrinsic activities for different ligands. Each one has got a different ability to activate that receptor. What are spare receptors? So they're just, you know, the full agonist produces 100% of tissue, but it doesn't have to bind to 100% of the receptors. That means there's some spare receptors there. And why does it have spare receptors? Because the cell is kind of modulating how much input it's getting from the environment. So if it's not getting a lot of input, it puts more receptors out. If it's getting a lot, it pulls them back. But neither of those processes is determined by Emax, okay? So Emax, the effect is kind of not determining how many receptors are going to be there. Okay, so this is probably the hardest question, I think the most interesting question. So when you look at these two curves, what's different about them? This is the normal, and this is the mutant. So first thing you can see here, resting tension, right? Tension at diastole a lot higher, or a little higher in the mutant. Okay, so that's one thing. Diastolic, that means diastolic calcium levels are higher than normal. Another thing, if you look at the slope of the relaxation, It's a lot shallower in the mutant, okay? And third thing that's different is the peaks are lower. Peak tension between resting and peak is lower in both the normal and the stimulated. So all these things should lead you to think it has something to do with the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. If you've got high resting cytosolic calcium during diastolic, then that means the ER is not sucking that calcium up, and it's staying in the cytoplasm. Although it could also be, sodium calcium exchange at the surface is leaving it there. So it could be cell surface calcium problem as well. But when you start looking at relaxation is all about, or mostly about, calcium being pumped into the ER, and that's a lot slower over here. So again, you're thinking ER. So what protein could be mutated in this? Something to do with calcium handling in the ER. So it could be phospholamban, it could be the SERCA. Could also be leak of calcium out of the ER. And I think we'll see that in the paper we talk about shortly, where calcium leaking out of the ER causes a high resting calcium and a little bit of tension during diastole. Okay, so that's mainly what I was looking for there. Look at all I wrote. Boy, oh boy. I must be smart. Okay, and the last one. This probably should have been easier too. I kind of tipped my hand to this with the practice exam because this was kind of on there in a different way. In the following experiment, aortic smooth muscle was exposed to norepinephrine for 1, 2, and 5 hours. After the time of exposure, norepinephrine was washed out, and a dose response curve was conducted. What conclusions do you make? Okay, so this is control with no pre-exposure. Pre-exposure shifts the ED50 to the right, still getting maximal response. Longer pre-exposure, and you're not getting maximal response, but the ED50 is the same. Longer exposure, same thing. So this looks like, this whole schmear looks like dose response of a tissue with spare receptors and adding higher and higher concentrations of irreversible antagonists. But what's actually going on, because you're doing pre-exposure, is you're getting downregulation of the receptors. And so this is a tissue with spare receptors, and the pre-exposure is causing downregulation of the receptors. And that's what's shifting it to the right and then decreasing the Emax. Okay, so hang on. I want to show you how it all came out for everyone. Noodle my love, noodle my love. How do I do this? Attempts. Okay, don't look. Don't see what everybody else got, but I want to show you the bottom. Okay, there. So everyone did really well on this. The lowest grade was in the C range. A lot of A's, so that means I'm going to have to make the next test a lot harder. Either that, or I just, instead of giving you a curve, bonus points as a curve, I can subtract points to get the curve back where it needs to be too. Whatever works best for you people. You know I'm all about you. Okay, so any questions about the exam? Does everyone want it to be harder next time? Give me a yes if you want it harder next. Mike says no. Dante says yes. Dante wants it harder next time. Looks like Estrella's behind you there. You're in the stars. I love it.
Yeah, I have to hook it up,
Yeah. Have you been growing your hair out on purpose or what?
Yeah, I was just looking for my hair tie, but I can't find it. So
okay.
Today.
Cool. It looks better this way. Okay, let's do a different share here and start our lecture for today. So today is all about the difference in the action potentials at different parts of the heart. And this is important because some drugs will affect this. So when we get into arrhythmias later, you'll see why different types of arrhythmias need different types of drugs. So kind of review a little bit. So we talked about this last time where the action potential starts here in the SA node, spreads over and across the atria. So the atria then get depolarized, and then it goes through the AV node and gets brought down to the bottom of the heart and through the bundle of His, and then gets spread by these Purkinje fibers up through the ventricular muscle. So these areas are going to have different shaped action potentials. And we're going to start with just looking at an axon potential in the axon of a neuron, an action potential in the axon of a neuron. So I think a lot of you have taken my drugs class already. We talk about this, but I just want to throw this out here just to show how cardiac is a lot different from neuronal. Now, just to kind of give you again the background for what electrophysiology is all about, what the electrical potentials are all about. You've got high sodium outside, high calcium outside, high potassium inside. And so if calcium is allowed to if potassium is allowed to freely move through the membrane potential will come down to the Nernst potential of potassium, which is about -80. If sodium is allowed to go in freely, then it will go up to the Nernst potential of sodium, which is about, I think, about +40 or +60 or something like that. And calcium, if it was the only ion allowed to move through the membrane potential would be about +200. Okay, because there's a big difference between calcium outside and inside. There's a big driving force for that to come in. So it would be very, very positive. So with our neuronal action potential, it begins with some kind of depolarization to threshold, right? And if you remember our drugs class, if you're in the drugs class, that depolarization comes from the soma, the cell body. So all the inputs come into the neuron and they reach the axon hillock, and that depolarization then starts the action potential in the axon. So this is kind of like an external stimulus to make the action potential start. Once it does, your sodium channels open. They go from the closed state to the open state, and sodium comes in, so the potential goes towards the Nernst potential of sodium. At this peak, those sodium channels will go from open to inactive. So they can't open again until you repolarize. And at the same time, or really slightly before, right about here, you've got Voltspined potassium channels going from closed to open. So now you've got positive charges going out, so we're going to repolarize. So you get repolarization of the membrane, and it goes all the way down below where it was at resting. And that's because you've got a lot of potassium going out. So at rest, you've just got a little leak potassium. So you're even more hyperpolarized here than you were at rest. So this is really the Nernst potential for potassium. That's about as low as it goes. And then those Voltspined channels will go from open back to closed, and you come back up to rest, where that resting membrane potential is being held by your leak potassium. So that resting is kind of important. Let me talk about that a little bit. So your resting membrane potential is always going to be closest to the Nernst potential of the ion that's most permeable. So at rest, the most permeable ion is your potassium leak. There's a little bit of sodium leak that is bringing you up higher than the Nernst potential of potassium, but it really can't get you much higher than that. So there's much more leak potassium than there is leak sodium. And so you've got a solid membrane potential there with the potassium controlling it. Now that's going to be different when we look at the SA node. SA node is very special. And what's special about it is it's constantly depolarizing. It never holds a constant rest potential. And that's because here at this phase 4, they call it, you've got a number of currents that are causing the membrane potential to change. So when I say current, I'm just talking about ions going through an ion channel. So sodium current is just sodium going through a sodium channel, calcium current, potassium current. So that's kind of the way it's usually spoken of. But anyway, here during this slope, you've got two different currents going on mainly. first is this funny current. And they call it funny current because, when they first started looking at these things, it was like most currents come on during depolarization, right? We saw that in the action potential, that the sodium channels are closed until it depolarizes and then it opens. And once it depolarizes further, the potassium opens and it comes down. Well, this is a current that shuts off during depolarization and comes on during repolarization. So it's the funny current. And this funny current is an inward sodium and potassium current. Now, there's not much driving force for potassium to come in, but it's available, it can come in. Mainly what we're talking about is sodium coming in, so we're constantly depolarizing. Now, you've still got a leak potassium current. There is some potassium current there, and that's why it doesn't just depolarize like this. So that inward sodium current is kind of leading you upward because it's stronger than the potassium current. And then once you get a little bit depolarized, you start opening these T-type calcium channels. So there are 3 different types of calcium channels: the N-type, L-type, and N-type. N-type, T-type, and L-type. So the N-type is a neuronal. So when we talked about calcium coming in the axon bulb during depolarization, the calcium that causes the vesicles to fuse and release neurotransmitter, that's the N-type calcium channel. The L-type calcium channel is the one that we see in the ventricular muscle cells that is allowing trigger calcium to come in. And and then there's the T-type, which are transient, and this is about the only place I know of them showing up. So T-type transient because this current comes on and goes off really quick. The opening of the channels is very short. Okay, that's why it's transient. L-type because when the channel opens, it stays open a long time. And then N-type for neuronal, L for long-lasting, T for transient. And the L-type are most important for us in cardiovascular pharmacology because these are also the voltage-dependent channels in smooth muscle, the exact same channel in a different tissue. And these channels will be sensitive to our calcium channel blockers that we'll talk about. So calcium channel blockers are really good for lowering blood pressure because they block this channel. Calcium can come in and the vessel relaxes. Here in cardiac, our calcium channel blockers are not going to have as much of an effect. We'll see them, they'll have a bit of an effect on heart rate, but not so much on contraction. And we'll talk about why when we get to the ventricular muscle. But anyway, right here in our SA node, first you've got this funny current depolarizing you a bit, and then the transient current adds to that and depolarizes you more until you hit this threshold. And when you hit the threshold, these voltage-dependent calcium channels open. So these channels operate very similar to sodium channels. They go from closed to open during depolarization, and then they inactivate. So these L-type calcium channels then are going to open. You get an upsweep of depolarization, and when you do, those calcium channels inactivate, and then your potassium current, your voltage-dependent potassium channels open, and you repolarize down to here. And now here is where your voltage-dependent potassium shut off, and we're back to start. So let me see, I think, did I skip something? Yeah, I did. Okay, so here the pacemaker potential then is the funny current, and the T-type calcium channels are giving you this slow depolarization. And then the 0 phase depolarization is your L-type current, okay, the long-lasting opening. And again, just like the sodium channel, it's going to inactivate. So then the repolarization is your voltage-dependent potassium channels, which gives you a potassium current. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so this is what sets your heart rate. And you know, your heart could be taken out of your body. I won't do this to you. I promise I'll never do this to you. But you could take your heart out of your body and it would continue to beat. As long as you supply that heart with nutrients and more importantly, oxygen, it will continue to beat. I used to do these experiments with rat hearts or guinea pig hearts where you take it out of the body, take it out of the sacrificed animal, and you put a cannula on the aorta and it forces fluid backwards through the coronary arteries and feeds the heart. and you could keep that rat heart going 12 hours or longer. But the beat is going to be constant. It's going to be set by this pacemaker potential. And you know, our heart rate is not constant, right? It's constantly going up and down. It's always changing. So we've got sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation of this pacemaker, which is going to do that. So how does that work? I'm glad you asked. So, and we'll get into sympathetic and parasympathetic on what day? Thursday. Today, Tuesday? Thursday, yeah. So here's your normal beat here, okay? Sympathetic stimulation increases cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will cause an increase in the funny current. So because there's more funny current, the slope is going to get steeper, and so it reaches a threshold a lot faster, and so your beats get closer together. Okay, so you're increasing heart rate by increasing the slope of that depolarization there. The vagus, on the other hand, vagus, on the other hand, it's your 10th cranial nerve, and it's the main parasympathetic neuron in the upper part of your body. It controls an awful lot of things. So the vagus also innervates the SA node, and when you have the vagus, basically, so the vagus, the sympathetic neurons are norepinephrine. The parasympathetic nerve, the vagus, is acetylcholine. So when you add acetylcholine to the SA node, it activates GI, and that decreases cyclic AMP, which is going to decrease the funny current. And then, by the way, this funny current, maybe I should go back and explain that a little more. The funny current is these weird channels that are activated by cyclic nucleotides. So often when we talk about metabotropic receptors affecting currents, it's because they're activating cyclic AMP, which is activating the protein kinase and phosphorylating channels. This is more direct. So your norepinephrine activates cyclic GMP or cyclic AMP production, and that directly activates these funny current channels. They're called HCN. Cyclic nucleotide. I forget what the H stands for, but the CN is cyclic nucleotide. But anyway, back to our vagus. So the vagal nerve then activates GI, which inhibits cyclic AMP production, which decreases your funny current. And it also activates potassium channels, which both of these mechanisms are going to decrease your slope. So when you decrease the slope then, when you increase the slope, you space your beats out and you're decreasing heart rate. Those are two competing autonomic nervous systems. So again, just quickly, funny current is mainly controlling this, and then voltage-dependent potassium channels controlling the depolarization, voltage-dependent potassium channels repolarizing, and cell controls heart rate, the body controls heart rate by controlling this in the SA node. Okay, atria. Atria have to contract, right? So in atria, we're going to see some trigger calcium coming in. So this atrial action potential is similar to our ventricular action potential. We've got sodium channels again. So keep that in mind, no sodium channels in the SA node. So here we've got potassium, a little bit of potassium current that's setting your resting membrane potential. The sodium current opens up and boom, you depolarize. And when you depolarize like that, you open these voltage-dependent calcium channels. And then you get this plateau phase, and then the potassium current brings you back down. So that's what we were talking about before. Okay, and this calcium, again, is that trigger calcium that causes calcium-induced calcium release. Once we get past the atria, we get into the AV node. Now the AV node is automatic too. So you get a similar pacemaker potential here in the SA node. And it's kind of like a fallback because typically your SA node is not driving heart rate. SA node is like the backup in case your SA or your AV node is the backup in case the SA node goes out, because you've got the same kind of slow depolarization here that would reach threshold, but stimulation from the SA node reaches it before it hits that threshold. So really the action potential here in the AV node is being driven by the SA node. Now, if you've got some kind of an injury, maybe a tiny little heart attack in the SA node region, which happens, you lose your SA node. So theoretically you could die, but you've got this backup plan here. So if the SA node goes out, or if there's a disconnect between the atria and the ventricle, supraventricular, what is that called? AV block. You got an AV block, so there's the SA node is no longer controlling the ventricles. You still get contraction, and the contraction is because of the depolarization here of the AV node. And the big difference again is the SA node is always faster, so the SA node will drive the contraction. But if you get AV block, your heart rate will go down to like 30 to 40 beats per minute. So clearly there's something wrong, but you will not die immediately. We'll die eventually, but we all do, right? Okay. Ventricular, we've talked about this a lot. I think we talked about this once before, but anyway, depolarization because of your voltage-dependent sodium channels. The voltage-dependent sodium channels go into inactive here, and it comes down, and right here, calcium channels are always delayed a little bit. They're slower than sodium channels. Here you've got the voltage-dependent calcium channels go from closed to open, and your voltage-dependent potassium channels goes from closed to open, so you've got this plateau phase. Your voltage-dependent calcium channels inactivate, and then you've got just potassium and you repolarize. And then your voltage-dependent potassium channels close and you go back to rest. So that's our ventricle. Okay, so in the different areas of the heart, you've got, I didn't talk about Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje fibers are very similar to ventricles. Both the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers have action potentials that are similar to the ventricle. So it's sodium dependent. Oh shit, didn't want to do that. Oh boy, where am I? Okay, so sodium dependent to get the depolarization. So what's important here is later when we talk about drugs that are going to be used, your calcium channel blockers will affect the SA node. So they're going to slow your heartbeat. They'll also affect the AV node and slow the conduction velocity through the AV node. But for arrhythmias, a lot of times what they give you is a sodium channel blocker, a lidocaine, right, or Novocaine. And that's because it will block some of these sodium channels and decrease excitability of the ventricles. Okay. And that's it for this. Oops, didn't mean to do that. That's it for this PowerPoint. There was something else I wanted to do today. Oh, yes. I remember now. Escape. New share. Wait a bit. Where is it? This is here. Hang on a second. Let me just find what I'm doing here. Good news, people. Guess what I have for you today? Everyone open up your Moodle page in a moment. Okay, open your Moodle page. If you notice, there's a new link there that I just unhid, and that's a workshop. So we're gonna have a little quiz. Why don't you spend about 15 minutes doing this, and then we'll talk about the answers. So this is based on today's lecture and Thursday's lecture. Thursday. And if you don't have Moodle available, I just open it up and I'm sharing it, so you can do that. So give yourself about 15 minutes to look at that, and I will be back. Okay, I had to stop that because share my video again. Okay, let's see your faces. Come on, don't be afraid. We're all friends here. We all got up late. Okay, who am I going to give a hard time today? Who looks like they need a hard time? Okay, in aortic stenosis. So now this is something we haven't talked about, but I think you can figure it out based on what we did talk about. In aortic stenosis, the aortic valve is narrowed, reducing blood flow. What effect would this have on stroke volume? So stroke volume is how much blood gets out per contraction of the heart. And I want to ask Matt Bernhard that question because I think he's not paying attention.
All right. Well, let's go out on a limb here. I'm going to say we'll decrease the stroke volume.
Correct. Why? Explain that to me.
Because each time the heart beats, less blood will be able to go out through the valve. So there'll be less.
Well, that's what you said, but why? Why would less blood get out?
Because the valve is narrowed, so less blood can physically go through.
Right. So the amount of blood that gets out is based on when the pressure in the ventricle is higher than the pressure in the aorta. So you're pushing against a higher pressure because you've narrowed that opening. So your pressure gives out before you get all that blood out. So you've got a smaller stroke volume and a larger end diastolic volume. Okay, we haven't talked about cardiac output, but what do you think? What do you think that means? Cardiac output is just mils per minute. Celine, what happens to cardiac output?
It's going to decrease.
Pressure? I'm sorry?
I said it's going to decrease.
Okay, right. And blood pressure? Think about it like the blood in your arterial system is like water in a balloon. What happens if you put less water in it? Pressure
it's not
go
going
up.
to fill up that much.
Right. And what happens to the pressure?
It's decreasing.
Right. Okay. We'll talk about this, I think, next week. Thursday, we're going to talk about autonomic nervous system control. And then next week, we'll talk about cardiac output, stroke volume, all this stuff. How would this affect your ability to exercise, Dante? Well, no, not Dante, because you don't exercise. Let's ask somebody. Oh, busting you. Okay.
Wouldn't it make it more difficult?
Right.
Yeah. I do have a question for the blood pressure. Wouldn't it affect the left ventricle? Like there would be like a large amount of blood pressure there because it can't escape?
Right. There'd be more pressure in the heart, definitely. But when we mean in the aorta or in the arterial system. So you're putting less blood into that, so that pressure comes down.
Okay.
But you're right, it'd be higher in the heart.
Thank you.
Okay, and you can exercise less because exercise is all about getting oxygen to your tissues, to your muscles, and you've got less cardiac output. Okay. The automaticity of the heart is due to slow potassium current in the SA node. Slow outward potassium current? That should say sodium current. I'm sorry. I know it's going to change all your ideas. It should be slow sodium current, right? That's the funny current, which causes slow spontaneous depolarization. The magnitude of this current, which sets the rate, is dependent on the concentration gradient of potassium across the membrane. Okay, so that's one of the things controlling it is that. I'm not sure this is a good question. What might be the effect of potassium loss, hypokalemia, on automaticity? Okay, so let me restate this question because I'm not sure it was written all that well. So your funny current is determining the rate, but also the funny current is fighting against a potassium current. So just like in other tissues, there's a leak potassium, and the leak sodium has to be greater than that leak potassium. And the leak potassium is based on the concentrations of calcium inside and outside of the cell. So if you decrease the calcium or the potassium outside the cell, how do you think that's going to affect the funny current? Matt Gamellan, does that increase or decrease the driving force for potassium to go out of the cell?
I have no idea. Decrease?
Let me just restate it. I know it's gotten complicated. So let's just start with potassium. So you've got high potassium inside and low potassium outside. Now you lower potassium even more outside. Does that increase the driving force?
Driving force in or out?
Out.
Yes, because there'd be lower concentration outside.
Right. So you've got more potassium going out. Now the balance between the funny current and this potassium current is setting that pace. You increase the potassium current, what happens to the slope of that depolarization, Ariana? Caught you looking away. So if you increase the potassium current, what happens to the slow depolarization of the pacemaker potential?
Wouldn't it also decrease?
Right.
Because they're going down.
Right, you're going to need more funny current to get depolarization. So if you decrease exterior potassium, you're going to slow the heart rate because you've got more driving force of potassium. You increase potassium, it's going to go the other way. Okay? I know it's kind of complicated. We didn't talk that much about electrophysiology, but that's the basic idea. How many people think they understood that? One, a little bit. Okay. All right, well, that's about all I have for you guys today. Thursday, as I said, we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system and test on Friday. Just kidding. Maybe I will get some practice questions up for you Friday so that you have something to do over the weekend. I know you're going to be bored, so I'll get that done. Okay, guys, we'll call it a day. See you later.